Have you ever had one of those experiences where you're driving along or maybe even walking along and suddenly you look around you and realize, I have no idea how I got here? And that's kind of the scripture we have today. Oftentimes, when we're in church or other places when we're listening to people reading scripture or maybe something else, maybe even the menu, we'd zone out. We don't really pay attention. And especially if it's in a church service reading scripture that we've heard a million times, we kind of think we know what's going on, so we don't really pay attention. That's the crowd that Jesus found himself in when he went back to Galilee and was talking in the synagogue. Now, the synagogue is where a lot of people gathered for worship. It was not a replacement for the temple, but it was a way for the community to get together in a place, in a building, just to have worship and listen to the stories, have conversations. And Jesus was there, having been a student there when he was younger. One of the myths, I guess, of the 20th century is this assumption that Jesus was a poor boy struggling. That is it comes out of a good place. It comes out of liberation theology, which has a real resonance with the poor, which Jesus did try to do. But he didn't necessarily resonate because that was his life. And we miss that point a few times. He was learned. He could pick up the scroll and read it easily. He was expected to teach his community. In fact, even more so because he now had a reputation around as a speaker, as a teacher, as someone who was worthy of listening to. So when he returned to his hometown, he was expected, as men of status were, to read from the scroll and to talk about it. We have something similar within the Christian tradition. I mean, it's not that visiting dignitaries are expected to pick up the Bible, read, and then preach, although sometimes they're asked to do that. But this assumption that those who are privileged have special rights, special opportunities within our faith community. And we don't really think too hard about what they say and what they read and what they do. We just kind of applaud and smile and, oh, isn't it wonderful? And hometown kid makes good and those kind of things. But when the hometown kid returns and challenges the status quo, not so much. I know a little bit about that personally myself. It's not welcomed. So Jesus comes into the synagogue, a place where he was quite familiar, where he grew up. He was asked, as a visitor, as someone who had some kind of not only family authority in the synagogue, but also as someone who was developing his own reputation beyond that, to read from the prophets. The process would have been that a special attendants would bring out the scroll, lay it out in front of him. He would have a pointer thing, possibly. I mean, Jewish people do. I'm not sure if that was still available, or that was available when the Hebrews were having this practice. But he would read a very narrow part. The scroll would just be opened to where he needed to read, because scrolls were delicate. They were not treated as paperbacks that we just kind of toss around. These were very, very well loved, well treated pieces of worship. So he would have had just that little bit of scroll open to him, and the attendants would be sitting back waiting for when he was finished. And the process wasn't just that he would read from the scrolls, but it was also expected that he would give some insight, give a reflection, give something that they could work on. And especially someone who now had a reputation of being a rabbi or a teacher, a leader, someone who was encouraging of the faith, someone who they watched grow up, and they were waiting for what he had to bring to them, and also thinking that they were special because they were his originators, his family, his place of growing and learning as a child. So the attendants were there, and Jesus picked up whatever it was pointer that he had, and he read the scroll, and he read from Isaiah. Now, what he read was not just several verses. He kind of jumped over and picked a few things, and we've got to give Luke some narrative leeway in this one, because he was making a point. He wasn't necessarily quoting verbatim Isaiah. that Jesus was reading from. And Jesus said, I bring I bring good news that the poor will be fixed, the blind will see, the prisoner released. All of these wonderful, wonderful things, and this is where we kind of relate as Christians. We sit in the church and say, yes, 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 it's all very, very good. That the year of the Jubilee is upon us. Yes, that's all fantastic. We can agree with that. That's not a problem at all. And then Jesus picked up the scroll himself. No, no. Rolled it up, passed it to one of the attendants. He should have left the attendants to attend. That was their job. Passed it to the attendants, and then sat down without saying anything or teaching them anything. Up until the point where Jesus was reading from the scroll, it was just a normal experience. The minute he touched the scroll, we have a whole other world we're on. And then Jesus sat down. So they were shocked that he wasn't going to speak or reflect on what he had read. And then he does actually talk and says, the scriptures have been fulfilled on this day. Little bold, little audacious. Let's unpack what that scripture actually was about, because many in the synagogue have heard it before. I believe they went through all the prophets throughout the year. I could be wrong in that, but I think that's how worship happens. So these were not stories that they hadn't heard and prophecies that they hadn't heard before. But Jesus saying that he was the fulfillment of them. So Isaiah was talking about liberation, about Jubilee, about the poor. Now, much like in our churches, the people in the synagogue would not have been the dirt poor. They would have been the comfortable, the ones who contributed to the coffers of the synagogue, who had comfort paying their taxes to the temple. Sometimes the good news, we for privilege think it's about them, and it's not. So the gospel was about the blind seeing. People can acknowledge that. But as we see in other scriptures, when you are healed of a disability, you lose the excuse for not participating in society. Some people don't want to do that. They're quite content to not have to step up and take that responsibility. We assume that it's what everybody wants, but not always. So the blind seeing, they could agree. The poor being tended. Well, sounds good in theory, but if the poor have equal to the well-off, what's the status of the well-off? He continues going through this. The prisoner free. Well, why are they in prison? People could generally agree that political prisoners probably, but what if there actually was a reason or assumed reason? And you had to accept someone who might be a risk. Not so comfortable. But the grand one is the year of Jubilee. Now, many Christians will hear that and won't think anything of it. There's actually a children's hymn called Jubilee Hey, which sounds really fun and joyous, but it doesn't explain what Jubilee was about. Jubilee was the 50-year promise that all land was returned to their original owners, and that if you were a slave or indentured servant, you were freed. Essentially, the wealthy were stripped of their wealth and their ability to make more wealth, more income. That was not good news for those who were comfortable. And Jesus sitting there and saying, this is all fulfilled today in me. We ended a bit of a cliffhanger because this week's lesson is a two-parter. Next week we see what else is going to happen. But Jesus upsets the order of things, completely turns the tables on the people who were so proud to have hometown kid make good, have them in their presence. Doesn't take long before they're not happy anymore. He's challenging their comfort. He's challenging their faith. He's challenging their ability to listen to what God had to say. And he's claiming his own self as part of the God's promise of renewal and revitalization and jubilee, changing up everything. When we hear these words, we let them pass through. But the phenomena that Jesus was presenting was earth-shattering. The Gospel of Luke is primarily social justice. It's about taking away from the rich and giving to the poor. Magnificat starts it all out. Mary saying this is the whole point before Jesus is even born. This is what Jesus' life is all about. We like the idea of it, but the reality of it is not something most of us want. Our churches are full of people who are extremely comfortable. They don't want to have to give back everything. Then there's the whole cadre of people who, how dare those who are beneath me think they are equal to me. Church is full of those types too. These words are challenging. That Jesus says all of this is fulfilled in me pushes the boundaries of everybody who has any kind of privilege, economic privilege, social privilege, political privilege. They're hard words. We fluff them off and don't pay attention because we really don't understand the depth of the meaning of these words. That we have to give back anything we have acquired. That the poor who are paying off their debt's canceled. They're free to do their own thing now. That's the message. That's the life-changing. That's the radicalness. When I see people talking about how we shouldn't have politics and religion, I'm kind of wondering, like, where did you get that idea? Political parties, sure, that's its own thing. But politics has always been part of religion. Jesus has always been political. What does it mean to be followers of Jesus and to listen to Jesus say, the year of Jubilee, the fixing for people who are vulnerable, for those who are not privileged, to those who don't have a high status in society, that happens now, and it happens in me. How does our faith go forward, especially when we're comfortable, knowing that the expectation is that we make ourselves uncomfortable so others can be equal? We leave this one on a cliffhanger. We'll pick this up again next week. We see the reaction to the people who had to hear this for the first time. They were not amused, but that's okay. They are us. We don't have to be amused. We just have to listen to the message, learn from it, and do something about it that's positive.